turning left here.
Oh my God! Don't stand there like I don't matter!
She was running on 4 hours of sleep, a nearly empty tank, and a prayer that the transmission would hold together for one more shift. Monica Hayes, 32 years old, had never once in her adult life asked anyone for anything she couldn't eventually pay back herself. That was the kind of woman. She was the kind who worked double shifts on holidays, who kept a spare granola bar in her glove compartment in case the hunger got bad between fares, who smiled at every single passenger even when her lower back was screaming and her eyes burned from staring at headlights. She had learned early that the world did not slow down for anyone who couldn't afford to stop moving, and so she never stopped. Not when her father left, not when her mother got sick, not on the cold February morning when her taxi, a 10-year-old sedan held together with faith and routine maintenance, was the only thing standing between her family and a very bad month. She gripped the wheel that Tuesday like it was the last solid thing in her world because, in many ways, it was. Monica lived in a two-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city with her mother, Ruth, who was 61 and recovering from a knee replacement she couldn't fully afford, and her younger sister, Danielle, 24, and finishing the last semester of nursing school on a partial scholarship that barely covered tuition. The three of them managed. That was the word Monica always used when people asked, they managed. The apartment was small but clean. The radiator knocked and hissed in winter, but it worked. Ruth kept a window box of marigolds on the fire escape, a small and stubborn act of beauty that she tended every morning with the same faithful attention she gave to everything that mattered to her. Danielle pinned her study notes on every vertical surface: the refrigerator, the bathroom mirror, the inside of the front door, so that nursing pharmacology and clinical practice guidelines were the last things you saw before you left, and the first things you saw when you came home. The kitchen smelled like whatever combination of ingredients could stretch furthest that week, and somehow Ruth always made it taste like intention rather than necessity. Monica paid for all of it: every bill, every copay, every tube of toothpaste, and every bag of rice, and every notebook Danielle needed, and every prescription Ruth required. She did it without complaint, because complaining took energy she could not spare, and because she genuinely believed in a bone-deep, stubborn way that had been with her since childhood, that things would eventually turn around if she just kept pushing. Her taxi was the engine of that belief. She had saved for 3 years to buy it outright, used but reliable, and the day she made the final payment she had sat in the driver's seat alone for almost 20 minutes before she could stop crying. It was the first thing she had ever truly owned, not leased, not borrowed, not contingent on someone else's goodwill. It meant she answered to no company, no dispatcher, no fleet manager cutting into her earnings. It meant freedom, the particular and precious kind that only people who have never had it fully understand. She had polished the dashboard the first day she owned it. She still polished it every Sunday. Her regulars called her the best driver in the city, and they weren't wrong. She remembered names, remembered the coffee orders of the downtown lawyers she picked up at 7:15 on weekday mornings, remembered which routes to avoid during game days, which hospital drop-offs needed a gentler touch. Mr. Patterson, who was 81 and went to dialysis 3 days a week, called her his guardian angel. She had once waited 45 minutes outside a school when a mother's babysitter fell through, and she had never charged a dime extra. That was Monica. She moved through the city like she belonged to it, and it belonged to her alert, capable, purposeful, with that particular kind of grace that comes not from ease, but from long practice in difficult conditions. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't connected, but she was respected in the quiet, neighborhood way that matters more than most people admit. And she was proud. That pride was important. It was the thing that made what happened next so devastating, and the thing that ultimately made her strong enough to survive it. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the sky doing that early autumn thing where it goes from pale gold to bruised purple in about 30 minutes. Monica had been on the road since 6 in the morning. She had $240 in her account and a rent payment due in 9 days. She was tired in the way that settles into the bones, rather than just the muscles, the kind of tired that a full night's sleep wouldn't entirely fix. She had just dropped a college student off near the university when the dispatch app pinged her with one last fare, a pickup 6 blocks west, headed downtown. She almost declined it. She was so close to calling it a night, to going home and putting her feet up and watching whatever Danielle was watching on television. But $240 and a rent payment in 9 days made the decision for her. She accepted the fare, signaled left, and pulled into the intersection just as the light turned green. That was when the silver car came out of nowhere. It hit her on the front left. Not a tap, not a nudge, but a genuine impact that shoved her taxi sideways and sent her coffee tumbling into the passenger footwell. The crunch of metal was loud enough that people on the sidewalk turned and stared. Monica sat still for exactly 1 second, hands tight on the wheel, running a quick internal inventory, neck fine, head fine, nothing bleeding before the full weight of what had just happened landed on her. She got out of the car on slightly shaky legs and looked at the damage. The front bumper was crumpled badly enough that the hood had buckled at the corner. The driver's side door panel had taken a hit and was dented inward at a slant that made it hard to close properly. She walked around the vehicle the way a person walks around something they love that has just been hurt, and the sick feeling in her stomach grew with every step. This wasn't a few scratched panels. This was body shop work. This was insurance claims and rental fees and income she couldn't afford to lose while the car was out of service. This was potentially weeks of her life dismantled in a single moment. She looked up at the other car. It was a silver sports coupe, the kind with a price tag that had more zeros in it than Monica's entire net worth. It had barely a scratch on its reinforced front grille. The door opened, and a man stepped out onto the pavement with the unhurried calm of someone who had never once in his life worried about a car repair bill. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit jacket with the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, dark hair slightly disheveled, jaw set in an expression Monica could not immediately read. He looked at the cars, then at her, and he said nothing. He simply stood there, apparently assessing the situation, with the detached efficiency of a man performing a calculation. To Monica, in that moment, with her heart hammering and her hands still faintly trembling, and the full weight of her financial reality pressing down on her chest, that silence read as contempt. It read as the silence of a man who knew he could make this problem disappear with a phone call and a checkbook, and who felt no particular urgency about the feelings of the woman whose car he had just destroyed. She crossed the distance between them in 5 steps, and she slapped him. Open palm, full contact, right across his left cheek. The sound was sharp and flat, and echoed off the buildings in a way that made the gathering crowd go absolutely, completely still. Ethan Carter did not move. He didn't flinch backward or raise his hands or make any sound at all. He turned his head slowly back to center and looked at her, and for a moment, the entire block seemed to hold its breath. He was 42 years old, and he had not been struck by another human being since a playground incident in 3rd grade. He was also, though Monica did not yet know this, the founder and controlling shareholder of Carter Technologies, a company worth approximately $4.7 billion. A man whose name appeared regularly in financial publications, a man who had once been photographed on the cover of a business magazine under the headline, "The Coldest Mind in Silicon Valley." He was, by most accounts, not a man you slapped on a street corner in front of a dozen witnesses and a phone camera. He was also, in this particular moment, still, perfectly still, his left cheek reddening faintly, his dark eyes fixed on Monica's face with an expression that was not rage, but was something she found even harder to interpret. Someone nearby said, "Oh my God," in a low voice. Someone else laughed nervously. A teenager 3 feet away had already lifted their phone. Ethan looked at Monica for a long moment, then looked at the cars, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. Monica braced herself. She assumed he was calling his attorney. She assumed the next few minutes of her life were going to be terrible. Instead, He made a single call, spoke 4 words, "I need a tow," and then looked at her again. "Are you injured?" he asked. His voice was calm and even and completely unreadable. Monica stared at him. "My car," she said, because she could not think of anything else. "Is damaged," he agreed. "We'll take care of it." And then his own tow truck apparently materialized from the ether, because it arrived within 8 minutes. And while the drivers handled logistics, Ethan Carter stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and said almost nothing. And Monica stood 10 feet away from him and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has done something irreversible and is still waiting to understand exactly how bad the consequences are going to be. The video was uploaded before either of them left the scene. By the time Monica got home that night, it had been shared thousands of times. The caption on the most shared version read, "Black woman taxi driver slaps billionaire after he crashes her car, no filter, no apology, all power." The comment section was the predictable chaos of the internet divided against itself. Half the responses celebrated Monica as a symbol of working class resistance, a woman who refused to be dismissed, a person who had looked wealth and privilege in the face and responded in the most viscerally satisfying way possible. The other half called her reckless criminal, unhinged, a woman who had committed assault in public and would deserve whatever legal consequences followed. There were people who turned her into a meme within hours. There were people who wrote think pieces before midnight. And there were people, a quiet, steady stream of them, mostly women, mostly people who had spent time worrying about bills and car repairs, and the fragility of the life you build by hand, who simply said, "I understand." Monica didn't watch any of it that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her cold coffee and stared at nothing, while Danielle hovered in the doorway asking questions she couldn't quite answer, and Ruth moved slowly around the kitchen making tea that nobody drank. Monica was not a person who acted out of pure impulse. She was controlled, measured, deliberate. What had happened on that street corner was not who she was, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She kept replaying the moment, the crumpled bumper, the man stepping out of his untouched car, the silence she had read as dismissal, and she kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. She had been afraid, not of him specifically, but of what the damage meant, of the thin edge she walked every single month, of the version of the future in which her car sat in a shop for 3 weeks, and the rent went unpaid, and Danielle's last semester hung in the balance. She had been afraid, and she had turned the fear outward, and she had hit a man who, for all she knew at that moment, had simply been quiet. The insurance claim confirmation came the next morning by email. The full repair costs for her vehicle bumper replacement, door panel work, alignment check would be covered completely by Ethan Carter's personal account, not through any insurance process. No claim filed, no deductible, no waiting period, just a direct payment to the body shop she'd listed, plus a rental vehicle arranged for the duration of the repairs. No lawsuit, no police report, no attorney's letter, nothing. Monica read the email 3 times. She called the body shop to confirm. Then she sat down and opened her laptop and typed his name into a search engine for the first time. What she found surprised her. The magazine covers were there, the business profiles, the cold efficiency of the public-facing Ethan Carter, a man who had built his company from a 2-person startup in a rented office into a global technology firm, who had survived a hostile takeover attempt in his mid-30s, who had divorced quietly 7 years ago and had no children, and apparently no personal life that made it into any publication. But underneath the surface layer of business journalism, there were other things. A hospital wing funded anonymously, the donation only traced to him when a board member slipped up in an interview. A scholarship foundation that sent 40 kids a year to college, run entirely without press releases. A community kitchen in his home neighborhood that had been operating for 6 years under a different name. A nonprofit that received a major annual donor, whose identity the organization declined to disclose. The pattern was unmistakable once you saw it. Here was a man the world had decided was cold, calculating, closed, and here, quietly, was evidence of something else operating underneath that surface, something careful and private and real. Monica stared at the screen for a long time. Then she made a decision. She was going to go apologize in person. Not because she owed him some kind of formal deference, not because the internet was watching, not because she was afraid of consequences that apparently weren't coming. She was going to go because she had hit a man who turned out to have paid for her car without being asked, and because her mother had raised her to look people in the eye when you owed them something, and because she could not keep living in her own skin without doing it. The decision was made by 8 in the morning. The execution took considerably longer. Carter Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a downtown office tower. The lobby was all glass and clean lines, and the particular brand of quiet that expensive places cultivate, the kind that makes ordinary people feel slightly too loud for the space. Monica arrived in her work clothes because she owned nothing that felt appropriate for the occasion, and she refused to pretend otherwise. She told the receptionist she was there to see Ethan Carter. The receptionist looked at her with the politely impenetrable expression of someone trained to be kind while being completely unhelpful. She was told Mr. Carter did not take unscheduled appointments. She was told she could leave her name and contact information. She was told, on her second attempt 2 days later, the same thing. On her third visit, a different receptionist, a young man who apparently recognized her face from the video, looked at her with something between sympathy and curiosity, and suggested she email the executive assistant directly. She did. She wrote one paragraph, no context, no explanation of who she was, just a straightforward request for 5 minutes of his time for a matter of personal importance. The response came the following morning, Thursday, 11:15, 15 minutes. She arrived at 11. She was shown upstairs, through an open-plan office where people moved with the focused energy of a place where the work actually matters, and into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Ethan was behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading something on a screen. He looked up when she entered. There was a moment of mutual recognition. Not warm, not cold, simply honest. And then he gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Miss Hayes." She sat down. She had rehearsed what she was going to say approximately 40 times on the bus ride over, and she said none of it. She said, simply, "I'm sorry I hit you. What I did was wrong, regardless of the circumstances, and I'm not going to try to explain it away." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology as well. I was distracted, and I should have been paying attention." "I'm sorry about your car," she said. "You already paid for my car," he said. "That's not the same as saying I'm sorry." There was a silence between them that was, unexpectedly, not uncomfortable. Then he said something she hadn't anticipated. He said, "For what it's worth, I didn't think you were wrong to be angry. I just didn't know how to respond in a way that would have helped." She looked at him. He looked back at her. And for the first time since she had sat down, she noticed that he seemed genuinely tired. Not the surface fatigue of overwork, but something deeper. Something that lived in a person for a long time before it shows up in the eyes. "I've stopped expecting much from people," he said, in the same even tone, as if he were noting a fact about weather patterns. "It makes things less complicated." She said, "That sounds lonely." He was quiet for a moment. Then, so faintly she almost missed it, the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the muscle memory of something that used to come more easily. "It is," he said. They talked for 43 minutes. She missed a fare. She didn't care. He called her taxi the following Monday. He gave the dispatch a name and a pickup address, and it came up on her app at 7:40 in the morning, and she stared at it for a full second before accepting. She pulled up to the building, and he came out and got in the back without any of the usual formality of a man who owns a car service. He said good morning. She said good morning. She asked where he was headed, and he gave her an address on the other side of the city, and they drove in comfortable silence for about 4 minutes before he asked her how the rental car was working out. She told him it was fine. He asked if her regular vehicle was back from the shop yet. She said it would be back Thursday. He nodded. They were quiet again. It was, somehow, not awkward. The silence had a quality to it that neither of them could quite explain to themselves. The kind of silence that feels inhabited, rather than empty, that belongs to two people who do not yet know each other well, but who are already, instinctively, at ease. He called again Wednesday and Thursday, and the following week, 3 times. Within a month, it was a regular arrangement, a morning pickup, sometimes a late evening return, always in her cab, always with that particular quality of silence that felt less like absence and more like rest. He had tried, over the years, to find that feeling in other places, in expensive, quiet restaurants, in the corner office, with the door closed, in the long stretches of solo early morning work before the building filled up. He had never quite found it. He found it now, reliably, in the back seat of a taxi he had no practical reason to keep taking. The conversations came gradually, the way conversations do between people who are both cautious but curious. He asked her about her family, and she told him about her mother's knee, and Danielle's nursing program, and the apartment with the marigolds in the window box. She didn't dress any of it up. She told it plain, and he listened in the quiet, attentive way of someone who had spent years in rooms full of people trying to impress him, and had learned to distinguish the sound of something real. She asked him about his work, and he explained it in plain language, without performance, the things he was proud of, the things that kept him up at night, the particular isolation of running something so large that the people around you started treating you less like a person and more like a variable. She asked him once if he had ever been truly happy in his marriage. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We were good at the same things. That's not the same as being right for each other." She said, "What happened?" He said, "She needed someone who could be present. I was always somewhere else in my head. I don't blame her." There was no bitterness in it, just the flat honesty of a person who had processed the loss into something clean and settled, even if it had taken years. She respected that. She respected it more than she expected to. There were moments of unexpected warmth. The morning she told him about the time she had gotten a flat tire on the expressway at 2 in the morning and changed it herself in the rain, and he laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that clearly surprised him as much as it surprised her. The evening he waited 15 minutes past his usual pickup time because she was running late, and when she apologized, he said, "I like having an excuse to finish my coffee outside." She learned that he couldn't cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. She learned that he had once wanted to be a landscape architect before mathematics became his language. She learned that he kept a small cactus on his desk that he had owned for 11 years and was obscurely proud of not having killed. She learned that he was funnier than the world knew, dry, quiet, precise, and that humor was how he tested whether people were paying attention. She was always paying attention. He began to look forward to the drives in a way he hadn't looked forward to much of anything in years. The back seat of her taxi had become the only place in his daily life where nobody wanted anything from him. She did not flatter him. She did not angle for favors. She did not treat his money as though it were a personality. She simply drove and talked and listened, and occasionally disagreed with him in the direct and unbothered way of someone who had nothing to lose by honesty. He found it there was no other word for it. He found it healing, in the way that a person who has been operating in noise for a very long time finds healing in a room that is genuinely quiet. He had not felt this known by another person in longer than he could precisely remember. What he did not notice, at first, was that someone else had been paying attention too. Victor Hale had known Ethan for 15 years. They had been partners, once co-founders of an earlier company that Ethan had eventually bought Victor out of, at a price that was fair by every legal and market measure, but that Victor had never quite accepted as fair in the emotional sense. Victor was the kind of man who kept careful accounts of perceived slights, who nursed his grievances the way some people nurse ambitions, with patience and focus and a long timeline. He had spent the last 4 years building a case against Carter Technologies, a network of minor shareholders he had quietly cultivated, regulatory contacts he had leveraged, and a legal strategy designed to force a proxy vote that could theoretically unseat Ethan from his own board. It was a slow, methodical plan, the kind that required no dramatic confrontation and could be executed entirely in the shadows of quarterly filings and regulatory submissions. It had been going well, And then Victor noticed the taxi driver. He noticed her first because of the video everyone had, but Victor watched it with different eyes than most people. He watched it and saw not a woman expressing righteous anger, but a connection being formed, saw Ethan Carter paying for the car without being asked, saw the repeated pickups, saw the pattern of something personal developing in a man who was famously impersonal. Victor understood, with the cold, tactical intelligence that was his one genuine skill, that this woman represented an opening, not a conventional one. But Ethan's documented weakness had always been the people he cared about, a small and carefully protected group, but not invisible. Victor had studied the pattern. If you could create sufficient crisis for someone in that group, Ethan's attention would fracture. His decision-making would be compromised. The proxy vote was scheduled for 7 weeks out. 7 weeks was enough time. The plan Victor put into motion was elegant, in the way that certain kinds of cruelty are elegant, simple, targeted, and almost impossible to trace at first. It began with a former financial compliance officer named Gerald, who had worked briefly at a company where Monica's mother had once done part-time bookkeeping 3 years ago. Gerald was not a bad man by nature, but he owed Victor a substantial amount of money and was not currently in a position to say no to favors. Gerald made a single phone call to a regulatory tip line, citing an anonymous complaint of potential fraudulent financial activity linked to an account in Ruth Hayes' name. The claim was fabricated entirely from whole cloth, stitched together from genuine account numbers and false transaction records that Victor's team had manufactured over the preceding 2 weeks. It was the kind of complaint that, on its own, would not have gone far, except that Victor had also, simultaneously, fed a version of the story to a financial news blogger who covered regulatory fraud cases and had a modest but real readership. The blogger ran a piece within 48 hours. The piece named no one definitively, but it was specific enough that anyone who knew the Hayes family could put the pieces together. Monica found out on a Wednesday morning when her mother called her, voice tight, with a kind of controlled fear that was worse than crying. Ruth had gone to the bank to deposit a check and had been told, apologetically and confusedly, that her account had been flagged and temporarily restricted pending a regulatory review. Neither Ruth nor Monica knew what that meant in precise terms, but the word regulatory had a weight to it that made both of them feel sick. By the time Monica drove home that evening, there were more pieces in motion. Danielle had seen the blog post, which had been reshared by someone who recognized the name, and a neighbor had called asking uncomfortable questions. And the apartment that had always felt like a safe harbor felt suddenly exposed and cold. Monica sat at the kitchen table for the second time in 2 months, staring at nothing. But this time the feeling was different. This time it was not guilt, but something raw and more frightening. The sense of a threat she could not yet see clearly, coming from a direction she could not yet identify. The following days were a grinding, humiliating ordeal. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit came by the apartment, polite, professional, clearly as confused as everyone else by the nature of the complaint, but obligated to follow procedure. Ruth gave her bank statements, her records, her old bookkeeping files. Everything was clean. Everything had always been clean. But clean records did not immediately stop a regulatory flag, and the account remained frozen while the process moved at the pace that bureaucratic processes move. Danielle's tuition payment was due in 3 weeks and was supposed to come from an account that was now inaccessible. The blog post had picked up secondary coverage on 2 other sites. Monica's regular customers were still calling, but one of the downtown firms that had given her a weekly account for airport runs sent a quiet, apologetic email saying they were pausing the arrangement until things are clearer. She understood. She didn't blame them, but she also felt, for the first time in her adult life, a helplessness so complete and so foreign to her nature that she barely knew what to do with it. She was a person who solved problems by outworking them. There was no amount of work that solved this. She told Ethan on a Thursday evening, on the drive back from a late meeting. She had not intended to tell him. She had been carrying it alone for 6 days, the way she carried most things internally, efficiently, with minimal display. But somewhere on the expressway, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely unrelated. The exhaustion and the fear simply broke through, and she told him all of it: the account freeze, the complaint, the blog post, the tuition payment, the airport firm. He listened without interrupting, which was what she needed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question: "Do you know where it started?" She said she didn't. He said, "I might." She looked at him in the rearview mirror. His expression was not alarmed. It was focused, the particular focus of a man who has learned to recognize certain patterns, and underneath it, something that looked, quietly, like fury. What Ethan did in the next 72 hours was the kind of thing that is only possible for a person with substantial resources, a first rate legal team, and a decade's worth of carefully maintained documentation of a former partner's behavior. He called his general counsel at 9 o'clock that evening. By the following morning, three private investigators were working in parallel, one tracing the origin of the regulatory tip, one pulling the financial records used in the complaint for forensic analysis, one running a complete background workup on every person connected to the fake transactions. The legal team filed a formal request for expedited review of the regulatory complaint, citing procedural irregularities, with enough supporting documentation to make the filing look less like a request and more like an answer. By Friday, the forensic accountant had confirmed what Ethan had already suspected. The transaction records used to build the complaint were fabricated, and the fabrication had a signature, a specific method of document manipulation that had been used before, in a different context, in a case that Ethan's team had quietly documented and never acted on. The signature pointed clearly to someone within Victor Hale's operational network. The confrontation, when it came, was not dramatic in the way confrontations are in movies. It happened in a conference room, with attorneys present on both sides, and it was conducted entirely in the language of documentation and legal consequence. Ethan laid out the evidence, the fabricated records, the traced tip, the blog coordination, the connection to Gerald, the connection to Victor, with the methodical precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of encounter for years and was quietly, completely unsurprised by where it had arrived. Victor's attorney asked for 48 hours. Victor's attorney got 48 hours to advise his client that the evidence was sufficient for criminal charges of fraud, defamation, and criminal conspiracy, and that the alternative to a cooperative resolution was a public prosecution that would end every remaining professional relationship Victor Hale possessed. Victor, whatever else he was a practical man. The cooperation was swift. The confession, such as it was documented and signed. Gerald, who had known all along that the favor he was doing was not a favor, provided a full account in exchange for leniency. The regulatory flag on Ruth Hayes' account was lifted within 36 hours of the filing. Monica got the call on a Saturday morning. She was in her kitchen making her mother's coffee when the number she recognized as Ethan's appeared on her phone. He said, "It's done. Your mother's account is clear. The complaint has been officially withdrawn, and the regulator's office has been briefed on the source. We're in the process of getting the blog posts retracted." She stood at the kitchen counter and held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. Ruth was in the next room. Danielle was asleep. The morning light was coming through the window, catching the marigolds on the fire escape, and Monica Hayes, who did not often cry, stood in her kitchen and cried quietly, quickly, with the particular release of a person whose body has been holding an enormous amount of tension for a long time and has finally been given permission to let it go. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't have to thank me." She said, "Ethan, thank you." He was quiet. Then he said, "Are you free this evening?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He told her at dinner, a restaurant she had driven past 100 times and never been inside, what had happened and what it had cost him to go public with the evidence. The proxy vote Victor had been building toward had, paradoxically, been diffused by Victor's own exposure. 3 of the shareholders Victor had cultivated had quietly withdrawn when the news of his fraud became known to the board. The legal situation was clean, but Ethan had made a decision in the course of those 72 hours that he had not made before. He had shown his hand, exposed the internal tensions of his company, put his own name publicly opposite Victor's in a way that guaranteed coverage and scrutiny. He had done it knowing exactly what it would cost him professionally, and he had done it anyway. Monica asked him why. He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly on the table, and then he looked at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as his version of openness, and he said, "Because someone went after your family to get to me, and I was not going to let that stand. Not for one more day." She held his gaze. She said, "You could have handled it quietly. There were other options." He said, "Yes, but none of them were fast enough." She said slowly, "You risked the company for us." He said, "I risked the company for you." The table was very quiet. Outside, the city moved and breathed in its usual Friday evening way, indifferent to the small, enormous thing that had just shifted in that corner of the restaurant. There was a period in the weeks that followed when Monica wrestled with the geography of what was happening between them. She was not naive about the distance between their lives, the apartment and the penthouse, the taxi and the sports coupe, the granola bar in the glove compartment and the restaurant she had never been inside. She had seen how that kind of distance played out. She had watched enough of the world to know that proximity to wealth, when it was not reciprocal, when it was tinged with gratitude or obligation, could quietly eat away at a person's sense of themselves. She had worked too hard and for too long at being her own person to hand that over to anyone, regardless of what they offered in return. She told him this, not in those exact words, but plainly enough that he understood. He listened to all of it with the same focused attention he always gave her. And then he said, "Monica, I don't want to give you anything that changes who you are. I've been surrounded my whole professional life by people trying to be whatever I wanted them to be. It's exhausting. You never do that. You just say what's true. That's not something I want to change. That's the entire point." She was quiet. He said, "I'm not looking for a passenger. I'm looking for a co-driver." She almost laughed. She said, "That was a terrible metaphor." He said, "I'm aware. I'm better at numbers than words." She laughed then, fully, and something between them settled into a new and more permanent place. He told her one evening, 3 months after the dinner, that she was the first person in more years than he wanted to count who had seen him clearly. Not the company, not the net worth, not the public architecture of the man he had been required to construct over decades of professional climbing, but the actual person underneath it, the one who had wanted to be a landscape architect, the one who had a cactus on his desk, the one who was funny in a dry, quiet way when he trusted the room enough to try. She had seen all of that and had decided not in spite of it, but because of it, that he was worth knowing. He said, "You are the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw something worth staying for, not worth leveraging, not worth orbiting, worth staying for." She put her hand over his on the table and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. They both understood the weight of what had just been said, and they both let it sit there, acknowledged and real, in the comfortable way of two people who have stopped performing for each other. The wedding was held on a Saturday in early June, outdoors, in the courtyard garden of a hotel that had been Ruth's idea. She had seen a photograph of it somewhere and mentioned it once, with the careful casualness of someone who doesn't want to be seen wanting something too much, and Ethan had quietly arranged the rest without making a production of it. When Ruth found out, she had sat down in the kitchen and covered her mouth with both hands, and Monica had understood, watching her mother's face, that the gesture was about more than a venue. It was about being seen in the particular way that people who have spent decades quietly surviving rarely are. There were not many guests, because neither Monica nor Ethan wanted many guests. Both of them had spent enough time in rooms full of people performing their feelings to know that what they wanted for this day was only the real kind. Ruth was in the front row in a pale blue dress, her knee mostly healed, crying happy tears before the ceremony even started. Danielle, who had graduated 3 weeks earlier and was already working as a registered nurse at a hospital 4 blocks from the apartment, was the maid of honor, and she gave a toast that made everyone laugh, and then cry, and then laugh again. "Mr. Patterson," The 81-year-old dialysis patient, who had called Monica his guardian angel, was in the third row, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him and a smile that was not. A number of Ethan's colleagues came, not the ones who had watched him from a careful distance for years, but the ones who had occasionally glimpsed the real person and had always hoped for this, for exactly this. The afternoon was warm, and the light was the particular gold of early summer, and the marigolds that Ruth had insisted on bringing from the apartment fire escape were in a glass jar on the welcome table by the courtyard gate. During the ceremony, Ethan spoke without notes. He said that for most of his adult life, he had believed that what he was building, the company, the work, the accumulated accomplishments, was sufficient, that it was enough to have purpose, even without the companion kind of closeness that most people called happiness. He said he had accepted this as a reasonable trade. He said that he had been wrong in a way that he was now profoundly grateful to have discovered before it was too late. He looked at Monica as he said all of it, steadily, the way he did everything without performance, without softening, with the full weight of meaning behind each word. Monica, who had written her own vows, said that she had driven 4 million people to 4 million destinations and had never once thought of her car as anything but a means to an end, a way to keep the lights on, to keep her family fed, to keep moving forward in the only direction that mattered. She said she had never expected anyone to be a destination. She said she was glad she had been wrong about that too. And then she said, very simply, and with the directness that had always been her defining quality, "You made me braver than I already was." That's the most anyone has ever given me. There was not a dry eye in the courtyard. Even the officiant looked moved. At the reception, someone brought up the car accident. It was Danielle who did it first, with the younger sibling's gift for perfectly timed chaos, and within about 45 seconds the entire table was laughing, Monica covering her face. Ethan shaking his head with the slightly helpless expression of a man who has fully accepted that this story will follow him for the rest of his life. Ruth laughing so hard she knocked over her champagne glass. Ethan's general counsel, who had heard the story many times, but not in this company, and with this level of cheerful irreverence, looked around the table at all of them and said, "I genuinely cannot believe this is how this started." Ethan said, "To be fair, I was being unresponsive." Monica said, "You were being impossible." He said, "That's fair." She said, "The slap was still wrong." He said, "Also fair." She said, "But you had it coming a little bit." He said, "I'm not going to argue with that at my own wedding." The table erupted again. They danced at the end of the evening, when the light had faded to a warm dusk, and the strings of lights they had strung between the courtyard trees had come on, and the music was slow and unhurried. Monica rested her head against his shoulder, and he held her with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned, belatedly, how to be still enough for another person to rest against. Around them, the people who loved them talked and laughed and refilled their glasses. Ruth was on the small dance floor with Mr. Patterson, who turned out to be a surprisingly capable dancer. Danielle was somewhere in the crowd being characteristically herself. The marigolds in the glass jar by the gate caught the low light and held it. Ethan spoke quietly against Monica's hair. He said that the accident, the crumpled bumper, and the ruined evening, and the open palm slap, and the entire improbable chain of events that had it was looking back at it now, from this particular vantage point at the end of this particular day, the single greatest piece of luck his life had ever produced. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him and said, "You have an unusual definition of luck." He said, "I have an unusual life." She said, "You do now." He smiled fully, without reservation, the smile of a man who has finally stopped calculating whether it costs him anything. She reached up and touched his cheek, the left one, lightly, and he caught her hand and held it there for a moment, and they both understood the precise weight and the precise tenderness of the gesture, and they were both, without question, entirely happy. There are people who find their way to each other through the smooth and expected channels, through introductions and first dates and carefully curated conversations at the right kind of event. And then there are the ones who find each other sideways, through crisis and accident and the unplanned collision of lives that were moving in entirely different directions until the moment they weren't. Monica and Ethan were the second kind. He had needed to be stopped in his tracks by something he hadn't scheduled, hadn't controlled, hadn't seen coming. Something that bypassed every layer of professional armor he had spent years carefully constructing. She had needed to learn that not every silence is contempt, that not every distance is dismissal, that the story of a person is almost never the story you can read from the outside looking in. They had each given the other something irreplaceable. She had given him the return of himself, the quieter and more human version he had spent years efficiently burying under the weight of what he had built. He had given her the knowledge that the stubborn, guarded, ferociously capable woman she was had always been worth the full version of someone's attention, not merely the portion that didn't require anything in return. The world is full of people moving past each other at speed, and most of the time, that's all it is: speed and proximity and the blur of other lives glimpsed from a window. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes two trajectories intersect at exactly the wrong moment. Sometimes the person who changes your life doesn't arrive with a perfect smile and a prepared speech. Sometimes they arrive with a crumpled bumper and an open hand and an anger that was really just fear dressed up in the only armor available. Sometimes it takes a slap across the face to wake a person up to the fact that they have been sleepwalking through their own story. And sometimes, if everyone is lucky enough, and stubborn enough, and honest enough to keep showing up, that waking is the beginning of something that lasts.